everyone, and welcome everybody, and to everybody listening in, and everyone who's joined us online. My name is Ali Khan, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the Federal Youth Network and a founding member of the Anti-Racism Ambassadors Network. Thank you so much for joining us today in what I'm sure is going to be an engaging and dynamic conversation on how we can all deconstruct colonial practices in the public service. I'm an able-bodied cisgendered male coming to you live from the region of Peel, which is part of the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Créé. Indeed, this is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, and the Métis people, and most recently it is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Créé First Nation. You know, it's thought by some that the term Mississauga is a word derived from the Anishinaabe word Minzazahi, meaning people living where there are mouths of many rivers. See, for the Mississaugas, water was and is a living spiritual being that flowed through all aspects of life. It was not a standalone entity, but seen as a critical part of a larger system whose components worked together harmoniously for the benefit of all. And I think that's an important analogy for today's conversation because like water, we all must work harmoniously and cohesively together to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people by taking meaningful steps towards reconciliation and decolonization. It was the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, the previous chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who once said that education got us into this mess, and it's education that will get us out of it. Well, today we're in the presence of some wonderful teachers who will guide us and show us how we can create a public service that is equitable, that prioritizes reconciliation, and that takes a decolonized approach to creating equity and removing barriers for all. Folks, our esteemed teachers today will be my friend, Dr. Nadia Ferreira, the newly appointed Ombudsperson for Indigenous Services Canada and adjunct professor in the Department of Anthropology at McGill University. She will be sharing some key thoughts around reconciliation and decolonization. She will be joined by Jolene Head, a director in the Indigenous Procurement Policy Directorate at PSPC, along with analyst Morgan Hurtubise, who will be providing an engaging presentation on Jolene's master thesis called Deconstructing Colonial Practices in the Public Service. Links to the presentation, the thesis, along with supplementary information from the Canada School of Public Services Indigenous Learning Series, and links from the Knowledge Circle of Indigenous Inclusion will also be presented in the chat for you all. We will be using today the Zoom platform, and throughout this presentation, you'll have the ability to ask questions and to engage with each other on the chat function. As we move through today's session, please share your comments in the chat space and share your questions using the Q&A button in the language of your choice. You can also vote your questions by clicking the thumbs up button as well. I want to acknowledge how difficult and challenging it is for Jolene, for Morgan, and for Dr. Nadia to do what they do. It is not easy for anyone to raise their voice and challenge a system which has historically been so oppressive towards Indigenous people. And so I want to acknowledge the gratitude that we have as public servants for the leadership of our speakers. Thank you, Jolene, for the tremendous research that you've undertaken in completing your thesis. Thank you, Morgan, for your backing of this project. And of course, thank you, Dr. Ferreira, for your long-standing behind-the-scenes support and allyship. In closing, I would like to circle back to the great Senator Murray Sinclair, who also once said that if you get rid of all of the racists in all of the positions of government, of policing, justice, and health, you will still have a problem because you will have a system that is functioning based upon policies and priorities and decisions that direct how things are to be done, that come from a time when racism was very blatant. Please keep that in mind as you listen to the courageous words of our speakers today. And without further ado, I would like to pass it over to my colleague Olivier, who will go over a few instructions in French.
Merci beaucoup, Ali, pour cette belle introduction. Donc, mon nom est Olivier et je travaille avec le Réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires fédéraux à partir d'un territoire traditionnel et non cédé Anishinaabe-Algonquin. Je vais répéter rapidement les instructions en français. Donc, au fur et à mesure que nous progressons dans la session d'aujourd'hui, veuillez partager vos questions en utilisant le bouton questions et réponses, on dit Q&A en anglais, dans la langue de votre choix. Vous pouvez voter pour les questions que vous voulez voir posées en cliquant sur le bouton pouce en l'air ou thumbs up. Je vous remercie d'être venu aujourd'hui et sans plus tarder, je passe la parole à Dr. Nadia Ferreira pour lancer cette importante discussion. Donc, à vous, Nadia.
Merci Olivier et merci Ali, le meilleur réseau, je pense, au gouvernement fédéral. Alors, merci à vous tous d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. What an honor to be here to introduce the amazing Jolene Head. I have so much respect for you, Jolene, and I know others will be inspired by you as I have been. So welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Nadia Ferreira. My pronouns are elle, she, and her. Je suis si reconnaissante, si honorée de vivre, de travailler et d'apprendre sur le territoire traditionnel et non cédé des peuples Anishinaabe algonquins ici à Ottawa. Please take the time to recognize the territory you are on at the moment. May these lands, their people, and their ancestors inform the work we do with our heads, our hearts, and our hands as we continue to collaborate and advance reconciliation. Speaking to those individuals with visual impairments, I have olive skin color, my hair color is black, and I have almond-shaped dark brown eyes. Today I'm wearing a turquoise type top with a denim jacket. My layers include the following. I am a soulmate, a mother, a daughter, a sister, cousin, friend, auteur publié. Et comme je dis souvent en anglais, on m'appelle a nerd. So yes, Jolene, I've read your whole thesis and I've enjoyed every page of it, every word in it. So thank you for sharing that. I'm also a lover of life, of humanity, and connecting with others. This is what makes me unique. So Jolene's work, as you will hear today, speaks to our moral commitment, our moral obligation to do better, to be better. Il faut qu'on déconstruise pour mieux reconstruire en collaboration avec les peuples autochtones. We, as public servants, need to embrace this commitment with a sense of urgency to do better, to engage in reconciliation is what I prefer to call reconciliation, and inspired by my good friend, Elder Claudette Commanda. And this essentially means exactly what Jolene talks about in her thesis, centering Indigenous leaders, Indigenous elders, and their knowledge. And applying what I love so very much is the head, heart, hand approach. This implies a lifelong journey of learning, of applying what we learn every day with our humility. C'est un cheminement continu. Et je vais décrire un peu mon cheminement personnel. I've been in the public service for 19 years. And in the last, I would say 12, 13 years of that, I've been facilitating dialogue and deconstruction through my delivery of cultural competence training, which has evolved into more, so to this day, cultural humility. J'ai donné cette formation depuis à peu près 2008 avec plus que 15 000 fonctionnaires autour de la nation. My training has evolved from cultural competence to cultural humility because I continue to be inspired by the head, heart, hands approach. And this came from an Indigenous scholar in Saskatchewan, just amazing concept. Cultural competence tends to convey a cognitive realm, and I needed more than that. I needed support in trying to bring this journey home and trying to push this journey forward and in the foreground of everything we do in the public service. Deconstruction necessitates self-reflection. So please take the time to define what makes you unique. It allows for you to be better at holding space for others. Jolene, your work is more than a master's thesis. It's a call to action to humanize the public service and to promote innovative leadership. That innovative leadership starts with each of us. This work requires a human-centered approach. On oublie trop souvent l'être humain. Mais comme je dis souvent, comme fonctionnaires, nous sommes des êtres humains qui travaillent avec des êtres humains, qui travaillent pour les êtres humains. So too often we forget the human in everything we do. We're so focused on process, on procedures, on guidelines. But as I always say, as public servants, we are people working with people, working for people. My vision through my work is to humanize the public service as inspired by Jolene's work in her thesis. It's about encouraging us all to connect with our compassion, our empathy, and our shared humanity. My emphasis has always been on the value and relevance of lived experience, inclusive of our traumas and our resilience. So as ombuds, as at Indigenous Services Canada, since last week, by the way, so it's relatively new, my plan is to do just that. So how appropriate, how relevant, how meaningful it is to be here today to introduce the amazing Jolene Head, who will guide you in her incredible presentation. And I hope everyone reads her thesis, which I hope will be published very soon. Just saying, Jolene. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Jolene Head. Merci mille fois, miigwech.
Ego say, Nadia, really appreciate that overwhelming introduction. Tanase Nitisine Casson, Jolene Head. I'm here today with my co-conspirator, Morgan Uterbies. Morgan will be helping with the French aspect of it, parce que je parle français lentement. Et c'est plus efficace pour Morgan et fournir les sommaires après chaque section. Donc, I'll be doing my portions in English and she'll summarize them after each section. So we'll just get started. Please get comfortable. This is going to take about 45 minutes. I'm just going to be barely scratching the surface of the contents of my thesis, but I'll be giving you an overview. So I'm a member of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation located in northern Manitoba. It's the community that claims me. In the federal government, I am, as Ali had noted, the Director for Indigenous Procurement Policy. I recently left my role as the Special Analyst on Reconciliation and Indigenous Engagement at the Public Services and Procurement Canada. I've been a public servant since 2001 and have spent the bulk of my career at Iskansurnak. I started my career in the Manitoba office where I spent 7 years. I then spent 7 years here in the NCA in the Lands and Economic Development area, and then 4 years in Calgary with Indian Oil and Gas Canada before returning to the NCA and in this current position. In 2015, I had the honor and the privilege of leading the MMIWG pre-inquiry engagement from coast to coast to coast. And it was this experience that fundamentally changed me, both as a public servant and as an Indigenous person. And it started me on my journey that partially led to the topic of my thesis. So the question that I have attempted to answer in my thesis was, how might federal public service executives support Canada's reconciliation efforts by identifying and deconstructing colonized practices in the public service? I chose this topic because I have a high interest in leadership, and in my current role, I have questioned the Crown's commitment on reconciliation. And after 20 plus years in government, I've also observed and participated in the EX role and understand the level of influence one person can have when occupying a key position in a hierarchical organization. I've observed the inconsistencies and contrasting approaches by departments on their efforts towards the government policy of reconciliation. And I wanted to understand and explore further how much influence EXs have on the culture and system, and whether that influence could be integral for dismantling colonial practices in the public service. So today I'm going to focus on reconciliation, decolonization, the public service and Westminster model, systems thinking, the public service culture, leadership, and on the research findings, conclusions, and recommendations. The information that was shared with me by Niwagamaganak was provided by 12 executives that ranged in levels from the EX1 to the highest DM level from various departments, 10 Indigenous employees from different levels in various departments, as well as 3 Indigenous individuals external to government were also engaged. Morgan, over to you.
Merci, Jolene. Jolene Head est membre de la communauté Cree de Opaskoyak, située au nord du Manitoba. Elle est directrice de la direction des politiques et de l'approvisionnement autochtone. En 2015, elle eut l'honneur et le privilège de travailler pour l'enquête nationale sur les femmes et les filles autochtones disparues et assassinées. La question qu'elle a tenté de répondre dans sa thèse était: comment les cadres supérieurs de la fonction publique peuvent-ils supporter les efforts de réconciliation au Canada en identifiant et déconstruisant les pratiques coloniales au sein de la fonction publique? Après plus de 20 ans à la fonction publique, Jolene comprend le niveau d'influence une personne peut avoir lorsqu'elle tient une position de pouvoir dans une organisation hiérarchique. Cette présentation se concentrera principalement sur la revue littéraire, les résultats de recherche, les conclusions et les recommandations.
Merci, Morgan. So there wasn't general agreement amongst academics, mainly Indigenous academics, on the meaning of reconciliation. However, what was interesting was how many noted that reconciliation in its current form in Canada has become politicized, decentering the Indigenous voice and replaced by the colonial one. One academic argues that reconciliation secures, legitimates, and effectively reproduces white supremacy and settler futurity in Canada, while another argued that government has co-opted reconciliation, seeking to cleanse its image through symbolic gestures. And many other academics agreed with this last statement. Academics and some Indigenous leaders recognize that Canada has taken efforts such as the UNDRIP Act, the commitment to implement the TRC's calls to action and MMIWG calls to justice, the restitution packages such as the 40 billion to children in the child welfare system. However, these actions were as a result of years of advocacy and litigation by Indigenous peoples. Most of the EXs that I engaged in this research spoke about and supported incremental change in the public service when it comes to reconciliation. One DG noted that large-scale transformational change is too hard for the public service. Academics also noted that Canada focuses on incremental change. However, the pace of change is glacial, as some academics have argued. Some of you may be familiar with Arthur Manuel, a former First Nation leader from BC, and he said, "You cannot deal in a spirit of cooperation and kindness with a system designed to steal everything from you and destroy you." And all of the academics read for this research generally agree that Canada is not addressing the systemic problems, or as Chief Clarence Louis noted, Canada is addressing the symptoms of the problem and not the problem itself. Morgan?
Plusieurs académiciens autochtones expliquent que la réconciliation est présentement politisée, contrôlée par la force coloniale du Canada. Le Canada a fait des actes positifs pour la réconciliation, tels que l'implémentation de la loi sur la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones, la promesse d'implémenter les appels à l'action de la Commission sur la vérité et la réconciliation, les appels à la justice de l'enquête nationale sur les femmes et les filles autochtones disparues et assassinées, et des restitutions monétaires, dont 40 milliards de dollars aux enfants dans le système de bien-être social. Les gestionnaires questionnés pour cette recherche étaient d'accord et appuyaient le changement incrémental. Par contre, Ce type de changement se fait très lentement. Arthur Manuel, un ancien leader autochtone de Colombie-Britannique, a dit « Tu ne peux pas opérer dans un esprit de collaboration et de gentillesse au sein d'un système construit pour te détruire. Le Canada semble adresser les symptômes du problème et non le problème en soi. »
Merci, Morgan. So in 2009, at the G20, former Prime Minister Harper noted that there was no colonialism in Canada, which I think we can all agree is factually incorrect. Like reconciliation, there is no standard definition of decolonization amongst academics. However, they all generally agree that it is a process which resists ongoing colonization, includes the reclamation and practice of our cultural and spiritual ways of being, reconnection to the land, and breaking free of colonial structures. So what does decolonization look like? According to one academic, it is the reevaluation of the political, social, economic, and judicial structures, and the development, if appropriate, of new structures which can hold and house the values and aspirations of the colonized people. Are we doing that as a public service? I argue that we are not, or at least not to the degree that achieves transformational change, and certainly not in a coordinated fashion. Decolonization requires the divestment of power by Canada, and I think we can all largely agree that this is a challenge for government and for the public service. How often do we hear discussions about how to decolonize the public service? Are we ensuring that other social justice initiatives like diversity and inclusion and anti-racism are also decolonized in their approaches? Or are we further perpetuating colonialism through our efforts in these areas? Some academics argue, for example, that anti-racism efforts are furthering contemporary colonial agendas because it ignores the ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples, and it fails to integrate Canada as a colonial state in anti-racism frameworks. This means that Canada's policies of assimilation remain unchanged, and Canada continues to hold on to Indigenous land base and resources. It means that Canada frames the anti-racism discourse. And one current example is Canada's recognition of Ukraine sovereignty while ignoring Indigenous sovereignty over territorial lands. Similar arguments have been made regarding diversity and inclusion and the manner in which these efforts are being framed. One academic argues that when Indigenous knowledge is recognized by the mainstream, it tends to be presented through the frame of Western epistemology rather than on its own terms. And if the mainstream perceives indigeneity as desirable, it will also define what is desirable about indigeneity. Again, these efforts may actually prevent transformational change of the system and instead reinforces the norm, effectively preventing true inclusion. Some academics actually see these efforts as marginalizing decolonization actions and refrains from confronting the fact that other marginalized populations also contributed to the ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples. Not only do we need to decolonize our minds and relearn the way we think, but we also have to ensure that decolonization occurs at the systemic and societal levels in which we operate. In contrasting reconciliation to decolonization, many academics argue that reconciliation has been politicized, is framed by Canada, not Indigenous people, isn't addressing colonial structures, and merely legitimizes state authority with no accountability. Whereas decolonization efforts appear to be more at the grassroots level, driven by Indigenous voices. Perhaps the public service approach isn't correct. Perhaps we as public servants need to acknowledge the truth about the system we maintain and focus more attention on decolonizing the system we work in. Perhaps it is also about recognizing, embracing, and normalizing the co-presence of other knowledge systems. Morgan?
En 2009, Harper déclare qu'il n'y a pas eu de colonialisme au Canada, ce qui est factuellement faux. Un académicien prétend que la décolonisation est la réévaluation des structures politiques, économiques et judiciaires. et le développement de nouvelles structures qui peuvent tenir et respecter les valeurs et les aspirations des personnes colonisées. Jolene argumente que la fonction publique ne fait pas cette réévaluation de façon à apporter un changement transformationnel. La décolonisation a besoin que le Canada se désinvestisse de pouvoir, et cela semble être un grand défi pour le gouvernement. Les efforts antiracisme sont interprétés par certains académiciens comme perpétuant l'agenda colonial, en diminuant l'importance de la réconciliation et des peuples autochtones. Par exemple, le Canada reconnaît la souveraineté de l'Ukraine, mais pas des peuples autochtones ici au Canada. Les efforts de diversité et d'inclusion font essentiellement la même chose. Nous devons décoloniser notre façon de penser, en plus d'assurer que la décolonisation se passe par les niveaux systémiques dans lesquels nous vivons. Il nous faut, en tant que fonctionnaires, se rappeler le système colonial dans lequel nous travaillons et s'assurer que nous ne sommes pas en train de le perpétuer.
Merci, Morgan. So the public service is involved in simple, complex, complicated, and chaotic systems changes every day. And when it comes to social justice initiatives such as reconciliation, we're talking about complex system changes, which are non-linear without right solutions. Systems thinking provides individuals with the skills to tackle complex, large-scale changes. It is the ability to understand the interconnections in a system to achieve a desired purpose. And until recently, I haven't heard anyone in the public service talk about systems thinking and how it might help us tackle complex problems that are becoming increasingly more frequent. For example, reconciliation, DEI, anti-racism, climate change, and pandemics. On the other hand, the Westminster system for which the public service is modeled is not built to address and solve complex problems. So how can we expect success in finding solutions to complex issues such as reconciliation if the system we work in isn't built to achieve the desired results? I argue that executives and all public servants need to learn and adopt new skills to better tackle the complex problems the public service is being confronted with. This includes non-Western worldviews and concepts like the Cree concept of Wokotowin, the Nuchaluth, the concept of Ishukish Sawak. These two concepts demonstrate that many Indigenous nations' worldviews are based on what would be considered similar to systems thinking. However, the difference is that this way of thinking forms the foundation of our culture and way of relating to the world. As one Indigenous academic noted, it's important to remember that First Nation communities are the original systems thinkers, and we continue to exhibit deep knowledge in the way we apply systems thinking to the way we analyze and act and communicate. So Wokotowin is a Cree word that means kinship, but it's more than that. It is also a Cree natural law, which expands the meaning of kinship to include all human and non-human relationships. It affirms the interconnectedness of all things physical and spiritual, and it emphasizes the responsibilities each individual must uphold as kin to all things. It is a relational concept that guides the daily life of an individual. It essentially requires each individual to understand the system that they navigate every day, their influence on that system, and their responsibility to the system. Hishukas-Swak, similar to Wokotowin, means everything is one or everything is connected. It is a guiding principle that contributes to a worldview that recognizes the need to respect the earth and the interconnections of the relationship we have with the earth because everything is one. It looks at the whole system while also recognizing its individual parts. Therefore, it provides an orientation to life and reality that allowed the Nuchaluth to manage their lives and communities for millennia. And I have no doubt that other Indigenous nations in Canada and around the world have similar concepts. Systems thinking, on the other hand, is a Western theory that has only been around for about 50 years. And I argue that it was Indigenous worldviews that influenced this Western theory. So when it comes to the public service, it seems to me that tackling a complex state like reconciliation, it behooves us to tackle reconciliation from an Indigenous lens rather than a Western one. However, we also work in a Western-based organization, which can make this challenging. Morgan?
La fonction publique travaille quotidiennement dans des systèmes simples, complexes, compliqués et chaotiques. La pensée systémique permet aux gens de comprendre l'intersectionnalité au sein d'un système, ce qui aiderait à comprendre les problèmes complexes plus fréquents au sein de la fonction publique, tels que la réconciliation, le changement climatique, une pandémie. Le système Westminster dans lequel existe la fonction publique est prédisposé seulement à résoudre des problèmes simples de façon linéaire. La réconciliation ne sera donc pas solutionnée dans un système Westminster. Comme l'a dit un académicien autochtone, nous, les communautés autochtones, sommes les penseurs systémiques originaux et nous continuons de démontrer une connaissance profonde dans notre application de la pensée systémique dans la manière dont nous analysons, communiquons et agissons. Le concept Cree Wakotowin et le concept Nuchunuth de Hechukish-Swak sont deux exemples de concepts non occidentaux qui ressemblent à la pensée systémique. Wakotowin est un mot Cree qui signifie parenté, mais c'est beaucoup plus que juste cela. C'est la loi naturelle Cree qui englobe tout être humain et non humain à la parenté, en plus des êtres spirituels. Chaque individu se doit de reconnaître le système dans lequel il vit, leur influence et leur responsabilité face au système. Hechukish-Swak signifie tout est un et tout est connecté. Ce concept reconnaît l'interconnectivité des relations que nous avons avec la Terre, parce que tout est un. La pensée systémique est une théorie d'à peine 50 ans. Il serait donc plus efficace d'utiliser des concepts autochtones qui existent depuis des millénaires pour aborder des problèmes complexes tels la réconciliation.
Merci, Morgan. And I apologize to my BC colleagues as I have difficulties with the Coast Salish pronunciation, but hopefully we were close. So the public service system and Westminster system are mechanistic, colonial, linear, and hierarchical organizations. They have a command and control culture, mainly centralized through PCO and TBS. Academics, and most recently some articles from public servants and journalists, argue that this system cannot handle the complex problems that we as public servants are confronted with today. In fact, over 60 years ago, the Glasgow report noted much the same limitations that we're still struggling with today. It proposed dismantling central agency controls over day-to-day administration of departments and giving managers discretion to manage within a framework of guidance and accountability. Instead, we've become more centralized, and authority has, over time, been pulled up to higher levels. The system is organized to have the central agencies act as the center of control and essentially the maintainers of the status quo. This status quo culture makes for a challenging environment for public servants to innovate, where loyal implementation has been prioritized over fearless advice. The current system cannot manage transformational change, which is why we as public servants have actually become conditioned towards incremental change, when transformational and holistic approaches to change are what is actually needed to address the complex problems of today. Systems thinking or Indigenous thinking as a leadership skill are required skills to begin to reform the public service. And in terms of reconciliation, the normalization of two-eyed seeing could also benefit all public servants. Morgan?
60 ans passés, le rapport Glasgow nota les limitations du système Westminster, ceux que nous rencontrons encore aujourd'hui. Le rapport proposa de démanteler le contrôle des organismes centraux et permettre aux gestionnaires la discrétion de superviser de façon responsable. Par contre, il semble que la fonction publique soit devenue plus centralisée et manque de transparence et de responsabilité. Les organismes centraux perpétuent le statu quo, empêchant les fonctionnaires de donner leur opinion franc et encouragent plutôt l'implémentation loyale. Les fonctionnaires apprennent à prioriser le changement incrémental puisque le système Westminster ne peut pas gérer le changement transformationnel. La pensée systémique ou la pensée autochtone sont des aptitudes de leadership nécessaires pour changer la fonction publique.
See, Morgan. I think it's safe to say that most of us recognize that there is a public service culture and an executive subculture. These cultures are passed on to new public servants through literature, mentoring, observing, and formal training. And much of the literature was critical of this culture, noting particularly for executives that they lack the fearlessness of their predecessors and instead have adopted a culture of loyal implementation. Stephen Van Dyne wrote an article earlier this year where he noted, is the public interest truly served when one is being marked mostly on how well one follows instructions or colors within the lines? This doesn't lend itself to inspired leadership or a culture of innovation and intelligent risk-taking. I found that most academics supported by the perspectives of the Niwaga argue that the public service culture is one of risk aversion, maintaining the status quo, and is complacent with the system's shortcomings, is slow to change, does not incentivize efficiency, and does not develop leadership skills required to face today's challenges. All factors that, in my opinion, kill reconciliation efforts. It's clear that colonialism is entrenched in the public service system, including our culture and language. We can implement all the incremental changes and perform all the land acknowledgements we want, but until we fully confront the elephant in the room, the colonial structure and the culture that maintains it, meaningful and true reconciliation cannot occur. Reconciliation requires sustained momentum from the willingness to challenge the current system, experiment and do things differently, and reflect on our perspectives and actions while also critically looking at the system itself and addressing the barriers in a meaningful way. We do not have an overall reconciliation vision for the public service. A collaborative approach with Indigenous peoples and a shared vision of the future state is essential. Some academics argue that inserting a bit of chaos in the system is also one way of achieving transformational change, because it creates uncertainty and ambiguity, which leads to a breakdown of current structures. COVID is a really great example of the insertion of chaos that effectively broke down the structure of how and where public servants conduct their work. However, our system and the traditional leadership skills utilized by most senior leaders is built for control, stability, and the known, making transformational change scary. Strong leadership skills are critical for transformational change. And when it comes to reconciliation, I argue that we need some chaos in the system to shake up public servants' inertia and complacency to create an open environment to conduct our work differently. There have certainly been attempts in the past to gathering strength. The Charlottetown Accord are two examples. However, I contend that they failed either because they did not meet the needs of Indigenous peoples, didn't include them, the province or territories objected, or simply that the public service could not handle the large-scale change. Systemic change is long-term and requires sustained effort. It goes well beyond election cycles and election platforms. And unfortunately, we also have individuals in the system who either passively or actively resist changing it with no or little accountability to Indigenous peoples. Lack of education, understanding of Indigenous peoples, and lack of appropriate leadership skills could also be contributing to this. And executives, as noted in the recent Apex report, have a myriad of responsibilities and priorities that they're unable to keep up with, particularly at the EX1 and 2 levels. So how do executives keep up with all of the priorities, expectations, and responsibilities of their positions? And how do the EX1s and 2s lead effectively if they themselves are being led by fear, as Apex noted? Morgan?
Nous pouvons être d'accord qu'il y a une culture au sein de la fonction publique et une sous-culture exécutive. Ces cultures sont transmises aux nouveaux fonctionnaires par l'entremise de littérature, de mentorat, d'observation et de formation officielle. Stephen Van Dyne note: l'intérêt public est-il vraiment servi lorsqu'on est marqué principalement sur la façon dont on suit les instructions ou dont on colore à l'intérieur des lignes? Cela ne se prête pas à un leadership inspiré ou à une culture d'innovation et de prise de risque intelligente. La culture de la fonction publique a une aversion au risque, maintient le statu quo, est lent à changer, est complaisante avec les lacunes du système, n'encourage pas l'efficacité et ne développe pas les aptitudes de leadership requises pour faire face aux défis d'aujourd'hui. La réconciliation ne peut pas être une réalité jusqu'à ce que l'on confronte le système colonial dans lequel travaillent les fonctionnaires. Certains académiciens argumentent la nécessité d'insérer du chaos dans le système afin d'apporter un changement systématique, puisque cela créerait une incertitude et une ambiguïté qui forcerait la destruction du système présent. La COVID-19 est un bon exemple de cela. Malheureusement, il y a des individus au sein du système qui sont ambivalents au changement, qui y résistent passivement ou activement, sans se sentir redevables au peuple autochtone. Un manque d'éducation, de connaissance des peuples autochtones et d'aptitudes de leadership appropriées pourrait expliquer cette résistance.
Merci, Morgan. So traditional leadership theories are not effective for addressing complex problems or for creating an inclusive culture that promotes flexibility, innovation, collaboration, or people-centered organizations. Academics argue that leadership is critical for transformational change. One academic argued that successful transformational change is 70 to 90% leadership and only 10 to 30% management. Leadership academics have argued that there are Western leadership theories which are most effective for large-scale change, but are not sought-after leadership skills in the public service. Transformational and change leadership, for example, both emphasize the need for a vision, high levels of communication and transparency, and building support from employees for that change. In other words, high engagement and communication with employees is required. These leadership styles focus on transforming values, moving from individual interests to collective interests. Paradoxical leadership, on the other hand, is human-centered, emphasizing communication, relationships, and trust, values that cultivate a condition of care and connection. And in a system, relationships are the most important aspect. It recognizes that everything is in relationship and recognizes that employees need to feel a part of a community where they matter. Additional characteristics include a strong sense of direction, high self-awareness, clear values, can let go and be open-ended. Some academics argue that these characteristics create an environment that can respond to change in an effective and human-centered way. So when we look at reconciliation specifically, human-centered and trauma-informed leadership are also important leadership styles as they foster relationships, focus on empathy, understanding, self-awareness, and growth. Trauma-informed leadership also means understanding trauma, its various manifestations, and how to best support Indigenous employees in particular who may experience intergenerational trauma or experience trauma as a result of working in the colonial system that is the public service. And I found it really interesting that most of these new leadership theories embody many characteristics that are also present in Indigenous cultures: collectivism, relationality, high values, and self-awareness, which encompass Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. Indigenous leadership characteristics are culturally and spiritually based and focus on values that serve the collective. They feature collective and consensus decision-making, distributed leadership, high personal ethics, and grounded in culture and ceremony. In many ways, Indigenous leadership and some of the new leadership theories are in stark contrast to the command and control of traditional leadership practices. However, I argue that it is exactly these types of leadership skills that are needed to achieve reconciliation and successfully transform the public service. One way we can directly contribute to reconciliation is to practice two-eyed seeing by normalizing the use of non-Western leadership theories, such as Indigenous leadership and seven-generation thinking. I contend that it would benefit the public service by creating a culture where leadership is shared, employees are cared for, decision-making is done collectively and from a holistic perspective, It is one way to decolonize the public service culture. Morgan?
Un académicien argumente que le succès du changement transformationnel est basé 70 à 90% sur le leadership et seulement 10 à 30% sur la gestion d'opérations. Les théories traditionnelles de leadership ne sont pas suffisantes pour adresser les problèmes complexes d'aujourd'hui. Le leadership de changement met l'emphase sur la communication et la transparence et bâtir un système de soutien pour les employés. Ce leadership se concentre sur le changement de valeur et de transitionner de l'intérêt individuel à l'intérêt commun. Lorsqu'il est question de réconciliation, le leadership centré sur l'humain et le trauma est aussi important, puisqu'elle met l'emphase sur l'empathie, la compréhension et la connaissance de soi. Les employés fédéraux autochtones qui travaillent dans un système colonial à tous les jours connaissent souvent des traumatismes. Ces styles de leadership semblent emprunter beaucoup de caractéristiques de la pensée autochtone et sont nécessaires pour atteindre la réconciliation et la transformation de la fonction publique. L'utilisation de leadership autochtone et de pensée de cette génération serait bénéfique à la fonction publique en créant un espace de leadership partagé où les employés sont priorisés, les décisions sont prises collectivement et de façon holistique.
Merci, Morgan. I'm going to move into the findings, conclusions, and recommendations now. And my thesis has 8 of each. However, I've been able to lump them together for the purpose of the presentation. So I'm going to go through 7, which includes all 8 of everything, but have been able to lump them by theme. So I used storytelling sessions to gather executive and external perspectives on the current barriers to reconciliation. And I use this information as the basis for the talking circles with executives and Indigenous employees, which focused on solutions. I employed Indigenous methodology based on my Cree culture and knowledge system for my research in order to center Indigenous thought. The findings are based on the data gathered from Niwagamaganuk, while the conclusions and recommendations are derived from both the literature and Niwagamaganuk. So number 1, meeting the TRC's calls to action number 57 has been insufficient. Therefore, I recommended that education, particularly for executives, needs to be more robust and include experiential learning. For example, similar to the idea of APTN's first contact, executives need to spend time in communities. And for those of you not aware, an article was just released last week that indicated that only 16% of public servants have taken any of the courses from the CSPS Indigenous Learning Series. So we're not doing a very good job on meeting the TRC calls to action number 57. Niwagamaganuk indicated that the CSPS courses do not go deep enough, that there are areas in the public service that are not incentivized to learn, and this negatively impacts decision-making and policy development. Indigenous employees and Indigenous people external to the public service also indicated feeling burdened to educate other public servants. One Indigenous EX stated, "I was brought to the DG's office and more or less told, we didn't really find an Indigenous manager or somebody that knows about Indigenous issues. So we found this really good person. She's super nice. Can you just train her in terms of understanding your culture and what it means and understanding what she should or shouldn't do?" And he said, rightly, he said no. An Indigenous DG shared, "I've just had to give 7 presentations in the last number of months because I took that one thing on because I found it was a serious barrier. And I find the burden always falls on Indigenous employees to be the educators in the public service." Number 2, people in key positions can create barriers to hinder change and progress in the public service. One executive shared, "Some of the public servants that I've encountered that are the most resistant to change in this area are also don't ever have to actually answer to Indigenous people." I concluded that executives create the tone and culture of the public service. Therefore, they play a crucial role in prioritizing meaningful reconciliation action. Therefore, I recommended that executives need to action a culture shift that encourages the disruption of the status quo and colonialism in the public service. One Indigenous executive shared their experience trying to get to the attention of leadership. We were trying to call a meeting. We were sending up briefings. It was being ignored. They really didn't want to deal with anybody who actually knew what they were talking about when it came to Indigenous women's issues. It was all these white older women bureaucrats who thought they knew best, and they knew what was best for the Indians. And frick, it was frustrating. Number 3, the public service is a colonial system which hinders reconciliation efforts. I concluded that the public service system cannot effectively address large-scale complex problems such as reconciliation. Therefore, a public service system reform to the hierarchical and colonial structure is needed to address today's complex issues, like reconciliation. One EX felt that the purpose of the Westminster system, and by extension the public service, was to control the relationship of Indigenous peoples through a paternalistic approach that supports capitalism, individual rights, and corporate culture. While another shared their thoughts on the command and control culture. We own too much control as a government in those acts, such as the Indian Act, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, and we've never thought about how we could give control up. Number 4, the public service and executive cultures hinder reconciliation efforts. Niwago-Maganak shared that there is a culture of control, of white saviorism, of Ottawa-centric thinking, of complacency to changing the system, of not being client-focused, and of perpetual underfunding related to Indigenous peoples. One EX felt that colonial, Western-centric, and paternalistic thinking dominates the public service culture and is cooked into the entire system. With regard to the EX culture, one non-Indigenous EX shared that they have been told that they've gone native and drunk the Kool-Aid when trying to disrupt the status quo for Indigenous peoples. I concluded that the culture change requires utilizing change management strategies, new leadership skills, and becoming comfortable with experimentation and taking risks. Therefore, executives need to action a culture shift that encourages the disruption of the status quo and colonialism in public service. Further, executives need to develop and utilize new leadership skills, which includes both non-Western and Western theory. Number 5, Indigenous peoples have become an industry, both internal and external to the public service, which acts as a reconciliation disincentive. One of the Indigenous Niwago-Maganak external to the government shared their dismay they had when a public servant who had never worked with Indigenous peoples before shared how excited they were because this experience would benefit their resume. I myself have heard some EXs indicate a desire to work on initiatives related to Indigenous peoples because they were sexy and get the attention of DMs and ministers. I recommended that implementing all of the recommendations in my thesis would address this internally. Number 6, the political arm of government hinders large-scale and long-term change in the public service. I concluded that reconciliation has become politicized, whereas decolonization is static and a non-politicized process. Therefore, decolonization of the public service is a necessary step towards meaningful and true reconciliation. I argue that reconciliation cannot exist without decolonization. However, decolonization can exist without reconciliation. Further, the public service needs to begin the process of decolonization to eliminate the system's colonial foundations. It needs to be separated from the political arm of government to ensure it is nonpartisan and receives long-term investment and commitment in the public service. Finally, the clerk needs to release a reconciliation call to action that includes executive accountability to Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous employees. This could include developing a shared vision of reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and the creation of an ombudsperson on reconciliation with a center of expertise to support the coordination of the public services reconciliation efforts, including reporting to Parliament and Indigenous peoples on our progress. Number 7, the public service is a challenging work environment for Indigenous executives and employees and has difficulties building trust and relationships with Indigenous governments. One Indigenous DG shared, "I'm getting tired of that analogy, death by 1,000 cuts, because actually it's more like I'll stab you. I'm going to stab you here, and I'm going to not get any of your vital organs. I'm just going to keep stabbing you, and you're not going to die from it. I'm going to injure you till you just stop getting back up and fighting me, because I'm not going to stop stabbing you." An Indigenous director shared, "It gives a sense of defeatism in fighting the system and people to do something different and leads to giving up the effort for positive change. I recommended that normalizing using two-eyed seeing will create a shift in the perception of public servants at all levels regarding Indigenous peoples. And finally, to build trust and improve the relationship with Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous employees, the public service needs to implement all of the recommendations in the thesis." Morgan?
Nous allons maintenant passer au travers des résultats que Jolene a atteints durant sa thèse en faisant des entrevues avec des cadres supérieurs, des employés autochtones et des employés autochtones à l'extérieur du gouvernement fédéral. Elle a 8 résultats, mais elle les a regroupés en 7 différents thèmes. Donc, on va passer au travers. 1. La réponse à l'appel à l'action 57 de la Commission de la vérité et de la réconciliation est insuffisante. Jolene recommande une approche plus robuste à l'éducation des cadres supérieurs qui inclut des nouvelles méthodes d'apprentissage telles que passer du temps en communauté. Les cours de l'école de la fonction publique ne sont pas assez détaillés. Ils laissent un écart dans les connaissances des fonctionnaires. Il revient souvent aux employés autochtones d'éduquer leurs collègues. 2. Les cadres supérieurs créent le ton et la culture de la fonction publique. Ils jouent donc un rôle d'importance dans la priorité de la réconciliation. Les cadres supérieurs doivent déclencher un changement culturel qui encourage la perturbation du statu quo et du colonialisme. 3. La réconciliation ne sera jamais réussie dans le système colonial de la fonction publique. Il faut donc abolir le système colonial afin de faire face aux problèmes complexes présents. Un cadre supérieur a partagé leur opinion que le système Westminster, et par ailleurs la fonction publique, a comme but de contrôler la relation avec les peuples autochtones par une approche paternaliste qui supporte le capitalisme, les droits individuels, la culture corporative et le pouvoir envers les peuples autochtones. Numéro 4. La fonction publique existe dans une culture de contrôle, du complexe sauveur blanc qui est contre le changement. Il faut créer un espace qui permet l'expérimentation avec la prise de risque. Les cadres supérieurs doivent développer et utiliser de nouvelles aptitudes de leadership qui incluent des théories de l'Ouest et des théories holistiques et autochtones. Numéro 5. Les peuples autochtones sont devenus une commodité désirée par les fonctionnaires. Des témoignages énumèrent les occasions où des fonctionnaires ont dit vouloir travailler sur les dossiers autochtones puisque c'était sexy et ça paraît très bien sur leur CV. Il faut démanteler cette pensée au sein de la fonction publique et peut-être même faire une recherche plus approfondie sur cette pensée à travers le pays complet. Numéro 6. La réconciliation est devenue politisée versus la décolonisation qui est statique et non politisée. La décolonisation de la fonction publique est nécessaire afin d'avancer la réconciliation. La fonction publique doit se séparer des politiques du gouvernement afin d'assurer qu'elle soit non partisane. Il faut aussi que le greffier publie un appel à l'action à la réconciliation qui inclut la responsabilité des cadres supérieurs envers les peuples autochtones, incluant les employés autochtones. Ceci pourrait inclure du travail de co-développement, la création d'un ombuds et d'un centre d'expertise. Et finalement, 7. La fonction publique est un milieu de travail avec plusieurs défis pour les cadres supérieurs et employés autochtones. La fonction publique a aussi de la difficulté à bâtir de la confiance avec les peuples autochtones. Jolene recommande de normaliser les styles de pensée autochtones afin de changer la perception des fonctionnaires envers les peuples autochtones. Afin de bâtir la confiance et une relation avec les peuples autochtones, la fonction publique se doit d'implémenter toutes ces recommandations.
Merci, Morgan. Apologies, there's reading through all the Q&As there. So we're almost done, folks, just into the conclusion right now. So I attempted to ground my research in Indigenous epistemology and grounded the work through Wekotowin and used Indigenous methods to gather the data from Niwagamoganuk. And none of this information is really new or groundbreaking. However, when it is weaved together, it tells a story. And it reminds us of the relationship, relationality of everything. And it demonstrates that nothing transformative can occur until we examine and address all the parts of the system. And as a result of this research, I'm no longer convinced of the current state of reconciliation in the public service, as I'm afraid it continues to perpetuate colonialism and has centered government rather than Indigenous peoples. And as much as I learned from this research, I also didn't expect to make deeply personal reflections and realizations. I began my research when Kamloops made their announcement, and I realized that I have denied how much the impacts of residential schools have impacted my life. And this was a very challenging research project and left me with more questions than answers. But I have come to believe that the actions of executives will decide the fate of reconciliation in the public service, and its fate will be decided by their commitment and motivation to change their thoughts and behaviors. The fate of reconciliation will be decided by how they motivate employees with their actions and how they engage Indigenous peoples in their work. And I'll just end with an exchange between Jean-Luc Picard and Guinan in episode 4 of season 1 of Star Trek Picard, because I am a little bit of a geek. I imagine myself as Guinan speaking to a respected elder. Guinan said, "You say change is coming? Well, it's too damn slow and the cost is too high. Being forced to watch it hurts." To which Picard replied, "History's darkest moments can be a tipping point for change. There's still good here." Égosé. Morgan?
Jolene observe que la réconciliation fut politisée, continue de perpétuer le colonialisme et se concentre sur le gouvernement fédéral et non les peuples autochtones. Elle croit que les actions, l'engagement et la motivation à changer des cadres supérieurs décideront du sort de la réconciliation au sein de la fonction publique. Son sort dépend aussi de la façon dont les cadres supérieurs s'engagent avec leurs employés et avec les peuples autochtones. Je termine avec un échange dans la saison 2 de Picard, où Guinan dit, et je paraphrase, « Vous dites que le changement arrive, eh bien, c'est trop lent et ça coûte trop cher. Ça fait mal regarder. » Picard réplique, « Les moments les plus sombres de l'histoire sont aussi les moments déclencheurs pour le changement. Il y a encore du bon ici. » Merci.
I think we can go right into the Q&As.
Perfect. So I was told to ask you the questions, Jolene. They, for some reason, are not in order of likes, but I will read the ones that have the most likes first. So first question, does this confrontation of the colonial structure of the public service need to come from the top of government, i.e. PMO, PCO, from the top of departments, i.e. MINO, DMO, or can it be done effectively by regular public servants? As a mid-level public servant, I'm finding it difficult to see my role in decolonizing the public service.
Goodness. I do think that though I focused on executives and their role in reconciliation, that my findings, recommendations, and conclusions are quite broad. And I do think that as individuals, there is much that we can do. And while we might not have a huge sphere of influence in terms of decision making, when we're in program or policy positions, we have the ability to challenge what we're reading, what we're developing, and start raising those questions and challenging leadership to think in a different way. We might not always be successful, but I think that if we keep pushing, and I did see one comment regarding whether or not the clerk has been engaged in my thesis, if we keep pushing upwards, I think that we start gaining that momentum, and leadership has to take notice. And we're seeing that in many areas when it comes to social justice issues within the public service. And I think that that's one way that we can challenge the system. But we're at the working level, we're the ones developing policy, we're the ones who are delivering programs and services. We can start critically looking at how that's being done. We can start being critical about the system that we work within and demanding change and being part of that solution, and looking for ways on how we can change that system as individuals within our particular areas of work.
Perfect. Any thoughts on ways to shake up public service culture or kickstart a shift towards more creative and anti-colonial and less status quo PS leadership?
I think honestly, and I want to really emphasize this point, is that I'm not an expert in anything, certainly not in this area. And I don't think that we can structurally change and transform the public service without Indigenous partners. I think this has to be a co-creation. And I mean, my ideal subversive self would love to just see the whole damn system blown up and recreated, because it's not just in terms of reconciliation that the system no longer works for. It's many of the complex, wicked problems that we face today as public servants. And we're not the only country that is struggling with this. The UK itself has think tanks that are looking at this and looking at the Westminster model and whether or not it is equipped to actually manage today's issues. And there are many different forms of democracy, and maybe we need to start looking at how this system, knowing that in general it does not work very well for what we're currently facing, needs to be changed. So I think when it comes to reconciliation, we can't forget that reconciliation involves two parties, the government and Indigenous peoples, and we cannot do anything without them by ourselves. We need to co-create and recreate the public service, if that makes sense.
I think you are touching on some points for the next question. I'll read it out anyways, and you might think of more things to add. Are we putting the horse before the cart to begin to include Indigenous knowledge prior to recreating the system? I often hear non-Indigenous folks who are perceived as the forward thinkers say things like, we need to adopt Indigenous ways of being, without effectively understanding or sharing anything further. The romanticization of Indigenous knowledge seems to exist today vis-a-vis what I call gray owling. I don't know what that is, so that might...
Gray owl.
Okay, what is an effective response to this?
Well, it's interesting because, as I found in terms of reading as much literature as I could get my hands on and listening to executives and Indigenous employees, leadership creates a culture, and that culture maintains the system. And I really do believe that if we can start to shift that culture, change that culture, it will impact the system itself. So if we don't start normalizing non-Western theory and non-Western knowledge within the public service, and I'm not saying just Indigenous knowledge, but there is other non-Western knowledge and theory out there. that could really help us in the public service. And I think if we start to normalize and embrace other knowledge systems, that we're going to impact that culture in the public service. We're going to start to shift it. And in that way, we're going to start influencing, legislation, HR practices, policy development. We're going to start impacting the way that we make decisions. And in that way, it's going to start to impact the system as well. So I don't necessarily think it's putting the horse before the cart. I think that Indigenous employees are well placed to start embracing their cultures and utilizing it on a day-to-day basis within the public service and normalizing it. And in that way, we actually do influence the system.
Thank you.
Just looking at the time, how much time do we have?
I don't know. We'll just keep talking until we're told to
Until
leave.
we're not.
What might governance look like transformed away from colonial structures to the oneness, we are one worldview?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yep. What might governance look like transformed away from colonial structures to the oneness worldview?
Well, and I mean, that's interesting. I like to use an example, and I apologize to any DFO colleagues that might be here today, but I like to use the example of two different departments and their kind of approaches, recent approaches to with Indigenous partners. And Parks Canada, I'd say, has some really good examples of really forward-thinking co-management, co-creation in terms of national parks, whereas we have some examples of the DFO response to the Mi'kmaq commercial fishery, and they're two very, very inconsistent approaches right now, and I think we suffer from that kind of siloed approach to everything we do within the public service. And our approach to reconciliation isn't any different. Our approach to DEI and anti-racism, it's all been left to the departments individually. And that really speaks to the individual nature of Western society, right? And the public service is very much like that. It's very individual. And I think if we start to see kind of a decolonized public service, we're starting to look at things holistically. We're starting to think of things from a collective perspective, seven generation thinking. I could use the example of return to work and our hybrid approach to going to work, and many of the world countries' responses to COVID right now. We're looking at the immediate economy and the impact of the immediate economy without really thinking about what might happen long term, and is the short term loss more beneficial in the long run to the economy itself, as opposed to the potential of having a mass disabling event and really having no labor to support that economy long term. And so I think that is the same within the public service. We lack shared vision in many ways, particularly with the social justice issues. And we have a call to action on DEI that every department is working on individually. We don't do a very good job at communicating best practices and working together all the time and collaborating. And what results is very different approaches in each individual department and agency. And I think we need to look at it from a much more collective and holistic approach. And I think that is one way to get to a more kind of, I guess, oneness or as a whole. Hopefully that helped with that particular question.
Thanks. I did have a peek at the agenda, and we still have 15 minutes, so we might have time for 15. More. Yeah, I think I'm doing the math correctly. So yeah, maybe 2 or 3 more. So on the point of burdening Indigenous peoples that you mentioned, How can we balance engaging in communication with Indigenous people so that we do not make assumptions about how to make positive changes without truly understanding, without burdening and putting the onus on Indigenous colleagues to educate us?
Yeah, and this, a similar question has been asked in previous presentations, and I would go back to what Ali said in his introduction and his quoting Senator Murray Sinclair about education. And I think that is key, right? I am happy, and this is just my personal perspective as an Indigenous person. I'm happy to engage in dialogue with someone who comes to me having already done the work, having already done some education on their own. They've done reading, they've done courses, they've put in the time, they put in the work, and they're coming to me from as informed place as they can to have that dialogue. And I'm very, very open to having those conversations when they come to me already informed. When they don't come to me from an informed place, it tells me that they don't want to do the work, that they just want me to give them the information so they can go on their way, not actually having to address their own worldviews and have those worldviews challenged. And I think that's really key is that education piece, just as Senator Sinclair has said.
Great, thank you. Would you be able to share any thoughts for employees who are actively working towards decolonizing? I said it too often in French. That's why. Sorry, Oh, I'm just going to skip over it. Their work, but face the tension between being perceived as contravening ongoing colonial practices and structures. What can leaders do to create psychological safety for employees who are ready and willing to do the work to dismantle anti-Indigenous oppression before the system is ready for real transformation?
Yeah, and I think that one's a tough one. And I think the person that asked the question actually answered it themselves in their question. I think a lot of it goes back to leadership and their openness to be challenged themselves as leaders. I think we could probably all agree that, when you get into positions of positional power and authority, that sometimes we let our egos get the best of us, that we think that we're in those positions that maybe we have more knowledge than others, and that we know best. And I don't think that's the case. We only know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. And I think, when you start thinking about the 7 grandfather teachings or the 7 teachings, humbleness is a significant teaching in that. And humbleness also means being able to be called in when we make errors and being accountable for that, but to be open to other perspectives and other ways of thinking. And so I think that it comes down to leaders being willing and open to being challenged by team members and to think differently and to be pushed to think differently. I think that's how we continue to have an organization that becomes a learning organization, that looks more at distributed leadership, that we're not, individuals are not experts about everything, that everybody has a say and a voice, and that they need to be respected and listened to and heard. And if they have something to bring to the table that is appropriate and relevant, leadership needs to take it seriously and to think about it and champion it. I think there are tons of opportunities for leadership at all different levels, and those in executive positions need to actually empower others to be able to take on different leadership roles and to see more of that kind of distributed leadership model happening within the public service.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's possible to decolonize? Decolonize, thank you. The public service, or should actions towards reconciliation be managed, initiated by an outside source that centers the Indigenous experience? I find it difficult to imagine how an institution that was built upon colonial acts and still symbolically represents the crown can become non-colonial through internal efforts.
Yeah, and it's a tough one. I think there are, I've seen kind of two schools of thought out there. I've seen some Indigenous activists and scholars indicate that they don't feel or don't think that we can decolonize government and the public service. And, I'm kind of the frame of mind of, well, what alternative do we have if we don't at least try? If we don't at least try to address the inequities within the current system? Because this isn't our first, this isn't just about Indigenous people. Colonization impacts many other minoritized populations within Canada. So even without reconciliation, if we think about decolonization and who that would benefit, if we try to decolonize the public service, it doesn't just benefit Indigenous people, it benefits other minoritized populations. So I think we have to try. We have to try to decolonize it as much as we can. Will we hit a wall? I think we will hit a wall at a certain point. And, my focus was again on the public service and not on the political side. And I think it's on the political side where we probably will hit a bit of a wall. But even there, one of the recommendations I put in my thesis was perhaps there is a way of inserting a bit of a decolonial kind of thought in Parliament by having an Indigenous Senate. And that isn't a new recommendation that came out of RCAP as well. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People also recommended an Indigenous Senate. And that Indigenous Senate would have the ability to review legislation that might and will impact Indigenous people. And I think in that way, we can have and start to have an impact. Will we completely decolonize the system? I don't know. But I just think we have to try, because it's not just for the benefit of Indigenous people, it's for the benefit of all Canadians.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. It feels like nobody in leadership roles at my department of nearing 10,000 employees and 4,000 executives are interested in reconciliation. And the president went as far to say there is little we can do to move the dial because our department's mandate isn't specific to Indigenous issues. I disagree. Any advice on how to navigate these waters where those, oh no, it moved. I'm so sorry. Where those in decision-making roles are not interested in taking these matters seriously?
Yeah, and this is probably one of my biggest bugaboos, to be completely frank. I think that every part of the public service, whether you have direct work with Indigenous people or not, can and have a part to play in reconciliation. I talk about and have done reconciliation socialization sessions within PSPC, and I've had that question raised a lot. And just talking to them for a few minutes about what their mandate is, I generally can point to a number of different areas where they can start thinking about how they can contribute to reconciliation. Security, for example, within the public service. One example there was, well, we just do security screenings. How we don't do anything with Indigenous people. And I said, yeah, but Don't your security screenings also impact government procurement? And if we have a government-wide 5% commitment to have 5% of the value of all contracts go to Indigenous businesses, they are required to do security clearing. Then we put into the fact that Indigenous people and other minoritized populations have a high criminalization rate due to systemic racism within the judicial system. So a lot of those individuals who might be working and wanting to try and get contracts with the government may have criminal records, which means that they won't pass the security screening, which means they are prevented effectively from partaking in a government contract. So you start thinking and putting and again, this comes back to systems thinking from a holistic perspective of what part of that system, greater system, do you play? And you say for security screenings, that ends up actually being a huge impact if you're able to address how to not get around, but how to also understand that there is an over-policing of minoritized populations, which will effectively prevent their participation in many ways in the economy. So I think, you know, there's critical thinking that is required within the public service, and given the pace that we often have to work in, we don't often have the opportunity to think critically about our work. And I think that that's where we need to start going, is spending more time. And even those areas that may not have direct involvement, there's many things that they can be doing. Indigenous hiring is just one simple example of having Indigenous people within that team. And having them help potentially, if they want to critically look at your mandate and your system and how it might contribute to reconciliation. But it isn't needed, I don't think, in terms of having Indigenous employees in a particular area just so they can help you with reconciliation. I think the heavy labor needs to be done by non-Indigenous people and non-Indigenous employees. But, you know, Indigenous employees were, I think, many of us very, very passionate about this work, and we want to see change. And for those of us willing to, I think we're there to support however we can. But I think it's time for the non-Indigenous employees to start doing the heavy lifting.
Thanks, Jolene. Thank you for your patience in my first attempt at being moderator and at my mispronunciation of certain words. I apologize to all those who submitted very interesting questions. We're just limited by time and can't get to them all, but thank you nonetheless for your participation. Jolene, if you're okay, I will pass the floor back to Ali. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Dr. Nadia. Jolene, you are so right. We have to be comfortable in taking risks, and this has to start from the very top. We definitely need an ombudsperson on reconciliation. We need a center of expertise, and we definitely need a call to action from the clerk. We cannot take meaningful steps towards reconciliation without also taking meaningful steps towards decolonization. Thanks, Jolene, for your answers to our questions from our audience. I love how you mentioned that folks at all levels, in all branches, in all departments and agencies can get involved in this work by critically raising the barriers that they see to senior leadership. By coming together and by raising our collective voices, we can be an effective voice for change, just like you have. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Our next event will be a GC Network Summit to be held on Tuesday. And following that, we're going to have a presentation on evidence-based ways to impact diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. I'll pass the mic over to my colleague Olivier for some comments in French. Thank you so much.
Bonjour tout le monde, je vais aller très rapidement parce que je vois le temps défiler. Donc, juste rapidement, merci beaucoup à tout le monde de vous être présenté aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup à nos présentateurs aussi pour cette très importante discussion. Donc, assurez-vous de vous inscrire au prochain événement. Suivez-nous sur les réseaux sociaux, c'est la meilleure façon de savoir ce qui s'en vient de notre côté. Donc, merci à tout le monde et à la prochaine.